Missing for the last 15 years. I lied about being a modern slave. With Banks's help, he attempted to smuggle huge quantities of harmful drugs into the UK. She was a straight-A student at a top university, but locked up for her role in narcotics trafficking plot. Fingerprints all over it. December 2016. A 15-year-old boy leaves his home in Liverpool and is never seen again. Eddie Burton, thin, slight, familiar to the streets of Walton and Kirkdale, steps into the winter city and simply disappears. The last confirmed sighting comes on December the 21st in the bustle of Liverpool city centre. After that moment, nothing. The calls stop. The trail ends. Police and family clung to missing posters and witness appeals, but weeks passed with no answers. What happened to Eddie Burton? Was he hiding? Was he taken? Did he fall prey to the city's shadows? After that, he vanished without a trace. Time moved on, but the missing boy's absence remained an open wound. To the public, Eddie was a runaway. To his family, a missing son. Few could imagine that this story was not ending, but beginning. Because years later, Eddie's name would resurface in the unlikeliest of places. Not in a hospital, not in a morgue, but in headlines describing him as the mastermind of a multi-million-pound narcotics empire. The baby-faced teen the public once pitied had re-emerged as a figure of power and control, orchestrating shipments across borders with chilling precision. How does a boy, once just a missing child, transform into one of Britain's youngest criminal kingpins? How does a vulnerable runaway build an empire stretching across countries, only to be brought down in the flashing lights of an Ibiza nightclub? This chronicle traces Burton's unsettling journey from the night he vanished into the city, through the construction of an underground network built on secrecy and technology, to the international manhunt that ended it all. Along the way, we will uncover the roles of his accomplices, the reach of his operations, and the investigators who followed his trail. It's the story of a missing boy who came back as the architect of a criminal empire. Not much is known about Eddie's childhood, just that he grew up in Walton, a working-class district of Liverpool. By all accounts, he was an ordinary boy, white, 5'6", short brown hair, a pale, freckled complexion, an ordinary face in the crowds of Liverpool. He became infamous the day he vanished. In December 2016, during the festive rush, Eddie's ordinary image fractured. On the morning of December the 21st, just before midday, Eddie was last seen in the city centre. Hours later, his family raised the alarm when he failed to return home. Police released his description with urgency: a grey hoodie, a dark blue jacket, a Hugo Boss cap, and grey jogging bottoms. Details that painted the picture of a typical Liverpool teen, and yet none of them brought him back. 2 days before Christmas, his family reported him missing. Posters and radio appeals pleaded for help. He was just 15 and vulnerable. Then came a strange development. Weeks later, in January 2017, a sighting was reported in Kirkdale. Hits Radio Liverpool tweeted an alert suggesting Eddie was still out there, and this was not the first time. Eddie had disappeared before, leaving police and family scrambling. What prompted these disappearances? At the time, no clear answers emerged. One account put it bluntly: Eddie had slipped off the radar, perhaps couchsurfing or mixing with the wrong crowd. Nobody knew that years later, true crime documentaries would describe him simply: a kid who vanished, then reappeared as head of a £20 million narco operation. Behind the scenes, however, the path was already shifting. What Eddie did in those months away was never fully documented. But by early adulthood, he had formed connections that reached far beyond Liverpool. Police would later confirm that he relocated from the UK in early 2021 to mainland Europe. Unlike his first disappearance, this was no accident. This was deliberate, never the act of a vulnerable child. This time, Burton vanished deliberately, embedding himself in networks in Amsterdam and Spain. And soon the world would see what he had become. By early 2021, Burton was no longer the missing boy from Liverpool. He had crossed into a new world, living between the Netherlands and Spain, territories known for their role in Europe's narcotics trade. The timing was crucial. In mid-2020, the encrypted phone network, EncroChat, long trusted by Europe's criminal underworld, had been infiltrated by police. Investigators read secret conversations in real time, and the fallout was devastating. Networks collapsed, arrests spread across countries, and the old order was fractured. Amid that chaos, Eddie moved quickly. At only 19, he inserted himself into Europe's trafficking hubs, taking advantage of the disruption. Where others were falling, he was building, and Eddie had a principle that set him apart: never get caught with the product. He relied on distance and intermediaries, recruiting couriers and using encrypted phones to make his shipments look like legitimate freight. Unlike flashier dealers, Eddie stayed invisible, later called a baby-faced enigma. By building his empire like a ghost, Burton stayed hidden just long enough to grow. By 2021, Burton was operating far from Liverpool, dividing his time between the Netherlands and Spain. Amsterdam and Rotterdam were Europe's main drug gateways. Spain's ports and party islands gave him cover and routes into the UK. For someone barely out of his teens, Eddie's footprint was extraordinary. Spanish investigators later confirmed he had set up shop between the Netherlands and Spain, from where he coordinated the shipments. Some thought he was just a front for older kingpins, but evidence showed Eddie himself ran the logistics like a corporate machine. By the summer of 2022, Burton's network was no longer hidden in whispers or encrypted messages. It was moving freight, massive shipments of Class A and B narcotics smuggled from mainland Europe into the UK. No small packages, no trickle through minor couriers. Eddie dealt in bulk. His scheme relied on freight vehicles carrying hundreds of kilos at a time. Coke, illegal substances, ketamine, multi-million-pound loads, disguised among legitimate cargo, rolling quietly through the ports. On July 3, 2022, one of those trucks reached the port of Dover. At first it looked routine, a lorry bound for Britain. Then officers pulled it aside. Hidden in the cargo, officers uncovered 90 kilos of ketamine and 50 kilos of coke, which was worth £20 million. Some packages were tucked into ordinary boxes, others brazenly placed in a little shopping bag. Wrapped and labelled with logos like FMA and Rex, they looked almost manufactured for the underground economy. The sheer volume was staggering. The seizure alone carried a street value in the millions, enough to flood clubs, cities, and entire regions of the UK. This was just one load. Evidence showed Eddie had orchestrated at least 2 such shipments that summer. By 23, he had scaled his operation into one of the most audacious smuggling schemes in the country. But when the packages were laid out, photographed by officers under stark lighting, one truth became unavoidable. Burton's empire was no longer a spectre in the system. It was now visible, tangible, and vulnerable. Just weeks after the first seizure, Burton's operation pushed forward again. On August 12, 2022, another lorry was intercepted at Dover. This time, the concealment was more advanced. border officers discovered a heavy-duty fuel tank that looked ordinary from the outside, but welded inside was a secret compartment. Hidden in that chamber were 142 kilos of coke and 25 kilos of controlled substances. The image is startling. Bricks of narcotics sealed in plastic, built into the very machinery of the truck. It was a tactic designed to outwit inspections, turning the vehicle itself into a smuggling device. The August load eclipsed the first. More coke, now heroin as well. Combined with July's haul, authorities had seized 307 kilos of controlled substances worth an estimated £24 million. In less than 2 months, Burton's network was exposed as an industrial-scale enterprise. At first, investigators could not be certain who orchestrated these shipments. Drivers are often caught, but they are rarely the masterminds. The second lorry's driver, a 64-year-old Latvian man named Marius Fridvalds, was arrested and later sentenced to 14 years in prison. A courier, likely chosen for his trucking experience, he may not have known the full extent of what he carried or for whom. But inside the trucks, investigators uncovered more telling evidence. Forensic teams found fingerprints and DNA that did not belong to drivers or customs officers. Some matched across both shipments, linking the same handlers to each consignment. And then came the breakthrough. The prints and DNA matched Burton himself. The boy who had once vanished into silence had now left his trace in steel and plastic. The young mastermind, so careful to avoid detection, had quite literally left his fingerprints on his empire. Finding Burton's fingerprints inside the lorries was a smoking gun. But it also raised a larger question. How had a 23-year-old from Liverpool placed himself at the centre of an industrial-scale smuggling network? Police soon gave the answer. Eddie was the orchestrator of the shipments, hidden behind encrypted chats. The National Crime Agency, Britain's equivalent of the FBI, took over the case as the scope widened across borders. As investigators dug deeper, the truth emerged. Eddie had been physically present in Europe during the loading of those consignments. His prints and DNA were there because he had literally handled the narcotics. What should have been an invisible empire was now stained with his trace. He had never been arrested in the UK, a false sense of safety reflected in his texts with his ex-partner Sian Banks. In July 2022, just days after the first Dover seizure, Sian panicked. Her fingerprints might be on the ketamine packaging. Eddie brushed it off with a text in his Liverpool slang. "You've never been nicked, or had your prints took anyway, so it doesn't matter." It was a fatal miscalculation. Forensics could still tie prints to individuals through intelligence networks, family matches, or data sharing. The illusion of safety only convinced Eddie and Sian to keep moving. The NCA had more than fingerprints. Messages recovered from Sian's phone revealed her direct involvement. Records showed she had flown to the Netherlands in late June 2022, helping Eddie prepare the first shipment before it left for the UK. The conversations placed her alongside him, confirming he was no distant figure but a young man orchestrating logistics on the ground. For investigators, this was a turning point. They now had forensic evidence, communications and witnesses placing Burton at the centre of the smuggling pipeline. The net was tightening. And yet Eddie, unaware of how much had already been uncovered, continued to operate as though he was untouchable. After the twin busts of July and August 2022, British authorities had enough evidence to name Burton as the mastermind. The National Crime Agency launched a formal manhunt in the latter half of that year, but finding him would not be simple. Eddie had left the UK in 2021, living between the Netherlands and Spain. When the NCA began searching, he was nowhere to be found on British soil. He had no fixed address in the UK, and likely no recent digital footprint tied to his real identity. By August 2023, Nearly a year after the Dover seizures, he was using an alias in an attempt to evade detection. The false name itself is unknown, but it was enough that in Spain or the Netherlands he never introduced himself as Burton. He likely changed phones, perhaps documents, and may have secured fake identification papers, common tools for traffickers, to rent apartments or travel unnoticed. Through 2022 and 2023, he stayed ahead of police. During this period, his ex-partner Banks became essential. While Eddie stayed abroad, Sean remained in the UK and acted as his domestic contact. Between June 2022 and October 2023, she travelled monthly to the Netherlands and Spain to meet him. These trips hinted she was moving information, money, or even product across borders. Evidence later confirmed that on at least 2 occasions in August 2022, Sean smuggled coke and ketamine back into the UK in her personal luggage after visiting Eddie in Amsterdam. Smaller loads than the truck shipments, but likely samples or cash flow cargo to keep the enterprise moving. Sean also took on the role of money handler. NCA branch commander John Turner concluded that Banks held a crucial role, laundering the illicit profits and acting as the UK-based facilitator for the network. She collected narco money, managed logistics, and ensured that despite Eddie's physical absence, the business ran smoothly on British soil. Burton managed his empire from abroad while Sean kept it running in the UK. But Sean's frequent trips and money movements did not pass unnoticed. The NCA was watching her closely, treating her as a key associate, perhaps even waiting for her to lead them straight to Eddie. Living abroad under his alias, Eddie believed he was beyond British reach. Yet behind the scenes the net was closing. The NCA worked hand in hand with European police, tracing his false identity. Even German authorities became involved, likely because one of the narco-laden trucks had passed through their territory, or due to Europol's intelligence sharing. Meanwhile, international warrants were issued. By the summer of 2023, Eddie's freedom was hanging by a thread. And yet the end came in the most unexpected way. He had drifted to Ibiza, the Spanish island infamous for its nightlife, perhaps to hide among the chaos or even to profit from it. Ibiza's clubs are saturated with controlled substances, and Eddie blended into that world, until one night in August 2023 when he walked into Pasha, one of the island's most iconic superclubs. Spanish police were carrying out a routine operation against local dealers inside the venue. They weren't hunting for an international kingpin, but that night they found one. Eddie was arrested inside Pasha for unrelated drug-dealing offences. In other words, they caught him selling on the side without even realising who he really was. It was a spectacular coincidence. In custody, routine checks revealed the truth. The man they had picked up in a nightclub was the very fugitive the NCA and its partners had been hunting across Europe. Headlines captured the drama. Man's arrest at Ibiza nightclub Pasha led to collapse of £20 million drug empire. Witnesses recalled Eddie smirking as if unaware his cover had collapsed. One report later quipped, "From missing baby-faced teen to smirking drug boss arrested in Ibiza." The transformation was complete, and so was the downfall. After his arrest, extradition followed. Because of European warrants, Eddie was first sent to Germany to face procedural charges, then ultimately handed to UK authorities in March 2024. Specialist officers from the NCA's Joint International Crime Centre escorted him back to Britain. The boy who had once vanished into thin air had finally been caught, dancing in the jaws of the lion. With Burton in custody, investigators turned their focus to the woman who had stood beside him throughout the rise of his empire, Sian Rose Banks. At 25, Sian was Eddie's trusted partner, involved in every stage of the operation. Her role was twofold: Abroad, she was Eddie's logistical assistant, flying frequently to Amsterdam and Spain, helping him prepare consignments of illegal substances. Evidence showed she packaged ketamine herself. Her fingerprints were left on the bags seized in July 2022. She likely assisted in concealing the narcotics within hidden compartments, working with Eddie in the assembly line process of smuggling. In Liverpool, she laundered profits, coordinated distributors, and managed money flows back to Europe. Her clean record delayed suspicion, but not for long. Her arrest in December 2023 was a turning point. When agents seized her phone, it revealed chats with Eddie, including the chillingly casual fingerprint discussion from July 5, 2022. The messages showed not only her complicity, but her active role in preparing shipments and covering their tracks. She also ran a COVID-19 travel document scam during the pandemic. This fraud painted her as someone willing to exploit any opportunity, large or small, to make money and keep the enterprise moving. But Sian wasn't the only associate. Beyond her and Eddie, at least one other figure stood out. 64-year-old Latvian driver Maris Fridvalds, arrested after transporting a shipment in August 2022. And while suppliers, engineers and distributors remain unnamed publicly, Spanish reports confirmed that Burton's conviction was part of a wider set of prosecutions, indicating others in his network were caught as well. Still, the true leadership was clear: Eddie as mastermind, Sian as deputy. By the time Eddie was extradited in March 2024, Sian was already behind bars. Facing overwhelming evidence, both chose to plead guilty. Eddie admitted to 4 counts of importing Class A and B narcotics. Sian, after initially denying involvement, changed her plea at the start of her trial in February 2025. She admitted guilt to 7 offences, including narco importation and money laundering. The last-minute plea spared her a trial, a likely tactical move in hopes of leniency. By then, Eddie and Sian were described as ex-partners. The pressures of arrest, looming prison sentences, and betrayal by their own evidence had fractured whatever bond once existed. Once a couple who built an empire together, they now stood separately, each seeking to mitigate their fate. As NCA Branch Commander John Turner put it, Burton, with Banks's help, attempted to smuggle huge quantities of harmful drugs into the UK, believing he could operate with impunity overseas. Banks held a crucial role, acting as the UK-based facilitator. He reminded the public that even without guns or violence, their crimes were far from victimless. Their heroin, coke and ketamine they trafficked would have fueled violence, addiction and exploitation across communities. Eddie and Sian's empire thrived on misery, turning suffering into profit. With both Burton and Banks in custody, the empire that once spanned borders collapsed inside a British courtroom. The case unfolded at Canterbury Crown Court, a stage familiar with Dover's narco smuggling trials. There, a youth once pictured on missing posters now stood smirking in the dock, as if defiant against the inevitable. But bravado could not mask the weight of what was to come. In February 2025, Sian abandoned her denial and pleaded guilty, ensuring that both awaited judgment side by side. Over 2 days, the court laid bare the truth: 307 kilograms of controlled substances, an international chase, and the nightclub arrest in Ibiza. The scale was industrial. The damage is incalculable. When the sentences came, they were crushing. Burton was handed 24 years in prison, a punishment that will keep him caged until middle age. A stark reminder that the law treats underworld kingpins as destroyers of lives, no less than violent offenders. Sian, charged with 7 offences from importation to laundering, received 5 years in prison for offence, enough to keep her behind bars well into the 2030s. Police claimed victory. The NCA declared that by stopping those shipments, they prevented untold violence and addiction from flooding communities. Their message was clear. Eddie and Sean thought they could operate with impunity, but international cooperation ended their dream. Yet beyond the official statements lies the disturbing reality. A boy, lost at 15, reappeared as a self-made kingpin. A young woman with no record became his deputy in crime. Together they moved hundreds of kilos of poison across borders. Together they fell. And so, as their cells close each night, questions linger like shadows. How does a missing child transform into a smirking villain? How many others vanish only to resurface in darker worlds? And in the silence of prison walls, will Burton ever realize the greatest horror of all, that the boy who was once searched for was found only when it was far too late?